Thanks for Frankie.
Ladies and gentlemen, we are starting the second session about problems of Jewish identity that are so old as the Jewish people, but the Jewish people survived despite these old discussions what it means. So let us hope that also in the next 100 years the Jewish people will continue to discuss what it means, Jewish identity. Now this session will be devoted to Jewish identity in the era of multiculturalism. So I don't know what it means. I don't know if many of us know what it means, because if you meet two Jews, you will never understand, and they will speak the same language, you will never understand what one means by being Jewish. And one will say I am a Jew, and the second will say that he is a Jew, and there are big differences, especially when I meet people in Mea Shearim. In any case, we try to, or our lecturers, we try to do their best to explain us what it means in different conditions and in different areas. The first lecture will be by my good, old, he is very young, but old friend, Gitelman, and most of us know him personally because he visited Israel very often, and he is a professor of political sciences. I will not read all his publications because it would take all the time, but in any case, he is working now, to my best knowledge, about Jewishness and Judaism, secularism and evolution in Jewish identity. It's the main work, but in the same time is dealing also with ex-Soviet Jews, whatever it means, in Russia, Ukraine, Jews in the Soviet military during World War II, the Jewish road to communist terror, and Jewish and secular Jewishness, and so on. Please, Gitelman, but I will be. I was instructed to be tough.
That's how much old friendship is worth. Mordechai, and I'm very pleased to be here at this occasion. I've learned a lot from Gidi Shimoni, both Baktuvim, Ube Alpeh, and I appreciate the chance to speak with you today about what I'm calling bringing the Russians back in. Those of you who are not political scientists may not remember a famous volume called Bringing the State Back In. In this case, I'm talking about the ambiguities of the so-called Russians, because most of them are not Russians but Jews, bringing them into the Jewish world. The changes in the former Soviet space have brought about a quantitative redistribution of the world's Jewish population and have created a qualitative, if you will, opportunity and challenge, the main one being the reintegration of Russian Jewry into what passes for a world Jewish community. Membership in that community, if it is indeed a community, is first of all voluntary. It is entered increasingly by individuals rather than by collectivities. It is not formally regulated, nor is it recognized. The community is, in some sense, a virtual one. It has no consensually recognized institutions, despite the claims of the World Jewish Congress, and I understand now that there are two World Jewish Congresses, the World Zionist Organization, or any other Jewish organization that has the word world in it. You should treat that with suspicion, just as I always follow the rule that any shul that has the word Agudas Achim in it, Shalom V'Shalva, Bet Shalom, is actually a split off from. In the United States, the former Soviet Union, and perhaps in the United Kingdom to a lesser degree, younger people do not feel the need to signal and legitimize their Jewishness by formal membership in a Jewish organization, whether it be religious or secular. Rather, Jewish feelings, quote unquote, and private behavior, rather than public activity and identification with organizations and institutions, these have become the dominant modes of Jewish expression. Moreover, the State of Israel, which has claimed to represent world Jewry in such matters as German reparations, trials of Nazi criminals, the causes of oppressed Jews in Syria, Iran, Ethiopia, and the Soviet Union, I think it's fair to say no longer commands the loyalty, affection, and even respect of increasing number of Jews, especially younger ones, let alone of non-Jews. And therefore, world Jewry, if it exists, and of course it does, but nevertheless it exists in an amoeba-like fashion. It's an amorphous body with no governing head, with no formal membership, and without the power to command and lead. It has neither power nor authority. Rules of admission have been largely tacit, not explicit, and we know that every club, tribe, nation, state has such rules, and the absence of such rules, or at least controversy about such rules, make our case, if not unique, at least fascinating. Mutual recognition, that is, as Mordechai put it, one Jew defining himself as a Jew to another Jew, has become a serious issue as marginal cases have appeared as challenges and with increasing frequency. Post-Soviet Jews present more challenges and more opportunities than any other group to those who wish for a tighter global Jewish integration and solidarity. And I'd like to look at three dimensions of these challenges. One is demographic, one is cultural, religious, and the last is conceptual. And the session this morning with Professors Avineri, Ben Israel, and Jacobson was most illuminating in the latter regard, following on Professor Walter's very stimulating talk last night, and I shall advert to some of those same issues. But being from the University of Michigan, I remain an empiricist, so I'll trouble you with facts, no matter how irrelevant they may appear to the theories. The demographic dimension, I rely very heavily on our colleague who's present here today, Dr. Mark Tolz, who I think has done wonderful work in this field. The basic fact is the extraordinarily rapid shrinkage of the population of Jews in the former Soviet Union. In 1989, the last Soviet census was taken in January of that year, fortuitously before the last big wave of Aliyah, enumerated some 1.45 million Jews. I think Sergio de la Pergola and Mark Tolz are right on when they estimate that today there are about, in the former Soviet space, 400,000 people who have two Jewish parents or who in some meaningful way are identified as Jews. So there has been a tremendous decline in that population. Obviously, much of it is due to the emigration of some 1.5 million Jews and attached non-Jews since 1989, about 60% of whom came to Israel, but also to an extremely low fertility rate among Jews, a high mortality rate as a consequence of tremendous aging of that population. As far back as 1959, in the first post-war Soviet census, the typical or the average or the modal, I forget which it is, Jewish family in the Soviet Union consisted of 3.1 persons. Translating that very roughly, one could say that was at best a one-child family, which, as we know, is insufficient for the reproduction and sustenance of such a population. Mark has told us recently that the number of children born to endogamous Jewish couples, that is to say, to Jewish parents, fell by 91% in the 5 years preceding the 2002 Russian census. And in 2002, there were only 3,130 Jewish children under 5 years of age. This is in the Russian Federation, and probably similar or even more drastic declines can be observed in others of the former Soviet republics. Now, one of the most venerable principles of Jewish social science is Vies Christelsach Hazeh Idelsach. That is to say, it's an untranslatable pun, but that is to say, what happens among the Jews happens among other peoples as well. We talked about that in the first session this morning. It's interesting to note that between 1989 and the year 2002, the Russian Federation lost about 2 million people. That in the first half of 2006, the population of Russia declined by 408,200. Deaths exceeded births by nearly 500,000 people. And Russia is now a country of immigration, which to a very small extent compensates for the decline of natural growth. Now, from the perspective of this world Jewry, however disorganized or unorganized it may be, the massive Soviet Jewish immigration can be counted as the former Soviet Union's loss, but as world Jewry's gain. And it's been a gain, of course, particularly for Israel, about from 1971 to 2003, about 1.7 million Jews and attached non-Jews, and that's the group I'd like to talk about most, came to Israel from the FSU, 908,000 of them in 1990 and thereafter. In the United States, it appears to be that about 345,000, or as many as 500,000 immigrants have come from the former Soviet Union, and the American Jewish community, which spent, how much, $4 million on the last flawed NJPR, has never bothered to systematically and empirically study the largest immigration, Jewish immigration to the United States, certainly since 1924 and probably since 1914. The Hapasuk Hazeh Omer Dolsheni, but this is not the place to do that. In Germany, we have at least 212,000 Soviet immigrants, probably or possibly as many as 240,000 between 1989 and 2004, all of which means that three societies, the Israeli, the American, and the German, have been, or should have been, profoundly affected by the immigration of these people. Now, that immigration, therefore, presents, I would think, a major challenge of defining membership in the Jewish polity or community. My limited understanding is that the issue has been largely ignored in the United States. In Germany, existing communities have, until now, as far as I know, been using halachic criteria for the admission to membership of the newcomers. Some estimates are that only 60% of the nearly 250,000 people who came from the FSU qualify under those regulations or under that practice. I don't see any visible source of demographic renewal for Russian Jewry. The small immigration from the Caucasus, Jewish immigration from the Caucasus to Russia, probably has ended as a result of Georgian-Russian political conflicts and Putin's reaction to them. Ukraine has the second largest number of Jews, about 103,700. And it's possible, given certain political and economic developments in Ukraine, that there would be some migration of Ukrainian Jews, almost all of whom speak Russian rather than Ukrainian, to the Russian Federation. That's not going to make a very big difference. What's curious is that it's been estimated that about 10% of the so-called Russian Jews who came to Israel have re-emigrated. Now, where have they gone? I don't know. If you take 10% of 900,000, however, that means that you have about 90,000 people who became, in Israeli parlance, who turned themselves from Olim to Yodim. According to official Russian and Ukrainian sources, from 1997 to 2004, about 12,400 people immigrated to Russia from Israel, and roughly half that number from Israel to Ukraine. That's about 20,000 people. What impact have they had on the Jewish communities of Russia and Ukraine? Again, I don't know. I have a little bit of anecdotal evidence that suggests that the Jewish schools in the former Soviet space have benefited from this return migration because students who come back from Israel come from one of the worst educational systems in the developed world, and that's by objective measures. That's not a subjective judgment. I wouldn't know. And they come highly disadvantaged, particularly in science, mathematics, and generally secular subjects. On the other hand, they come equipped with the Hebrew language, some knowledge of Jewish tradition, and so on, so they can coast, as it were, in those subjects while catching up in the subjects in which they lack, and therefore the Jewish schools, and for other reasons, are attractive to them. One final possible source of migration is, in an age of globalization, more and more people do not reside permanently in any single place. And because of linguistic and cultural assets, Soviet-born businessmen, now in Israel or other countries, may be advantaged in conducting their affairs in the FSU. Now, what impact will these transnationals, these people who have an apartment here and an apartment there, a passport here and a passport there, what impact will they have on the communities? It's hard to say. In general, in a globalizing world, it's difficult to fix exclusive citizenships, residences, and communal commitments. One final note in this subject area, I think it's time we stop talking about FSU Jewry. Because increasingly, the Jews of Russia, of Ukraine, of Georgia, of Moldova, of Lithuania are different from each other. Within a generation, they will not even share a language. They will not even share the Russian language. So that FSU Jewry, the term I'm using now, will, like me, rapidly become an anachronism. Let me turn now to the cultural and religious challenges that this group presents. We had an iron curtain of separation between Soviet Jewry and world Jewry for many decades. That was penetrated a little bit in 1939-41 with the arrival of the so-called Zapadniki, the Western Jews from Eastern Poland, Lithuania, Northern Romania, who infused Soviet Jewry with some knowledge and some symbols and some recollections of what Jewish life had been before the Russian Revolution of 1917. After 1944-45, that curtain closed again, and it began to be penetrated only slightly by tourists in the 1960s, which was then followed, or the 1950s, which was then followed in the late 1960s and thereafter, but what I would call a purposive tourism. That is to say, Jews who were going to the Soviet Union not to see the wonders of the Kremlin Armory or the Winter Palace, but rather to bring whatever Jewish messages they were bringing, primarily to so-called refuseniks, but these were not really opportunities for deep mutual cultural enrichment or long-term education. The next stage came in the late 1980s with Glasnost and Perestroika, where you now had what I would call ethnic and religious entrepreneurs, people who came to sell not goods, but ideas, knowledges, and beliefs. Ukrainians from Canada, Poles from Poland, Armenians from the United States, Balts from the West, to such an extent that the chief of staff of the Estonian army, the presidents of Latvia and Lithuania, were former American citizens. The first foreign minister of Armenia was Rafi Hovhannisyan, 32 years old, born in California. So there was this kind of export, or re-importation, if you will, of people with roots, with ancestry in those areas, and that, of course, included many Jews who began to descend on the Soviet Union and its successor states. They were either bringing the word of God or the word of Herzl to these benighted Jews who had been bereft of Jewish knowledge, and they thought mistakenly of Jewish identity. Big mistake for these many decades. The main players, as we all know, were the Jewish Agency, various arms of the Israeli government, religionists of various kind, and the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee. And in the early period, even B'nai B'rith, World Maccabi, and other moribund institutions who thought that they would find their salvation, indeed their renaissance, in Soviet Jewry. It's interesting who did not do this. The conservative Masorti movement displayed very little interest. Modern Orthodoxy is represented by Yeshiva University, B'nai Akiva. The Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations displayed mild interest. The Reform movement displayed much more interest, and there are about 100 Reform congregations now in the FSU, but they are severely underfunded. By contrast, it is said that Chabad Lubavitch spends approximately $60 million a year in that area. I think more than money, they have an asset which no other Jewish organization anywhere in the world can claim, and that is people who are personally devoted to a mission, not to a job. People who are prepared to uproot themselves from wherever they may have been and spend the next 40 or 50 years of their lives in such delightful places as Perm or Chelyabinsk or Krasnoyarsk and so on. 71 Chabad schools, 60 kindergartens, etc., etc. Without detailing the statistics, despite all of these inputs, I would guess, and it's a guess, but it's based on interviews with several thousand Jews, that there has not been a religious revival in the FSU among Jews. And if we go back to the discussions that we had last night and this morning about religion and ethnicity, it's very clear that Soviet Jews accepted the Soviet concept of what to be Jewish is, namely nationalnost, which is not to be translated as nationality, but rather, sorry to use the word, ethnicity, right? And not as religion. Therefore, in the Soviet concept, unlike what we talked about this morning, you could be a Jew by nationality and a Catholic by faith. There was no inherent contradiction, and in fact, we do have quite a few Jews who have become Pravoslav, who have become Russian Orthodox, and yet consider themselves as Jewish as anyone on the streets of Yerushalayim. Jewish schools are seen in the West very often as the panacea to what ails world Jewry. They are the best antidotes to Jewish ignorance, lack of religious observance, and intermarriage. The Abichai Foundation report of 2002 counts about 12,000 Jewish students, or students in Jewish schools. That number has declined somewhat. You may say, well, 12,000 out of a population of 400,000 isn't a lot. I don't know what the percentage, well, forget about percentages. Let's deal with absolute numbers. 1988, no Jewish school of any kind, religious, secular, any kind, in the former Soviet Union. So this is a very big change. What is the cultural challenge to bringing the Jews back in? I think it is the challenge of a non-religious Jewish culture. Can it be created to attract the loyalties of FSU Jews? Given the fact that they have accepted the notion of Jewishness as ethnicity, given what I think is the fact of no religious revival on a mass scale, and none likely in the future, though lo navi anochi v'lo ben navi ela boles shikmim, it seems to me that the only Jewish culture that would be viable would be a secular kind. But it cannot be the recreated secular culture of the 1890s through the 1939. Yiddish is gone. Compact Jewish settlement is gone. Special niches in the economy no longer exist, although Jews are extraordinarily highly educated and completely urbanized, yes, but they do not live in compact circles. So what will be the content of such a culture? Well, I've used the term thin culture in some of my writings, and I think this will be the content, as it is for many American Jews, for example. A kind of Herbert Gansian symbolic culture. If you march on March 17th in the St. Paddy's Day parade and you drink green beer, that makes you Irish, at least for a day. So if you go to a Pesach Seder or to Hanukkah and Purim, which are clearly much more important Jewish holidays than Tisha B'Av or Yom Kippur, because they involve food, family, and fun, right? Then you are expressing your Jewishness. That kind of Jewishness, and I speak to my fellow American Jews as well, who don't like it when I tell them, is a pastime. It's a hobby. It's a leisure time indulgence for its consumers. It is not the kind of ethnicity that directs one's life and that determines one's behavior, that is all-encompassing and that creates strong and permanent loyalties. Ultimately, it is the former Soviet Jews themselves who will bear the full responsibility for the construction, maintenance of Jewish life, and that means developing the personnel, public, and resources necessary for it. The Joint, the Chabad, and so on cannot sustain a community which does not want to sustain itself. Now, that raises another problem, one which was adverted to in this morning's session. There have been broad cultural shifts in Western societies which have implications for the Jews who live in them. Where once Jewish journals were filled with political, cultural, theological, and social ideas, today, reflecting those social changes, their content is about individual feelings, choices, lifestyles, with the possible exception of Israel-related issues. And from my tone of voice, you can see how I feel about those feelings. We have shifted from collective concerns to individual ones. Norms are established not by groups, but by individuals. What works for me is sufficient to legitimize choices. And that may be especially true in the FSU, where official norms have been discarded, and I'm speaking broadly now, as well as Jewishly, no single set of values, beliefs, and guides to behavior have replaced them. Marxism-Leninism is dead. Russian Orthodoxy is trying to replace it. It's not clear what will, if anything. Most Soviet Jews have neither texts nor role models, neither ancestral nor contemporary. There are no acknowledged leaders and authorities. The leadership of the Russian Jewish Congress has changed often. The rabbinic leadership carries no weight with the mostly secular Jews. There are neither organizations nor institutions that can speak authoritatively in the name of Russian, Ukrainian, or any other post-Soviet Jewry. That is precisely why some Jews and non-Jews react to the individuation of norms and to the increase in individual liberty with self-effacement, with submission to what they see higher authorities as higher authorities, whether it's the Lubavitcher Rebbe or Vladimir Putin, Lahavdil, or a church figure. We see cults of personality, literalism and fundamentalism, self-abnegation in order to serve some supposedly higher collective cause, counterposed to the egoistic individuation and relative normlessness in the same societies. I want to turn now to the third challenge and the last challenge with which I will deal, and that is the conceptual one. Ethnic groups are defined by two things: content and boundaries. That is to say, what is their culture, and the fence which they draw around themselves to say, you are in and you are out. Soviet Jews were left without content, but they had very strong boundaries. The boundaries were created by the state, since every person had an identity, not only as a Soviet citizen, but as one of more than 100 possible nationalities. That, as I learned this morning, has been abolished in the state of Israel, L'Om. That too has been abolished in Ukraine and in Russia at the latest in 1997. So what we have are Jews who are Jews by boundary, and Jews by affect, because they developed informal, non-consensual, and rather loose notions of the boundaries that demarcated Jews. According to our research, I and two colleagues in Moscow, very, very few accept the notion, the halachic notion, that Jewishness is determined by the mother's Jewishness. On the other hand, and to go back to a word which we were uncomfortable with this morning, they firmly believe in descent. Not dissent, but descent. D-E-S-C-N-T. They have not gotten the message of Western political correctness. One can freely speak with highly intellectual Russians, Jews, etc., about words such as blood, ancestry, and similar notions, even race. Jewishness is acquired through blood, not by conversion or conviction. Biological descent and an ineffable feeling of belonging, subjective feeling, how I see myself, is what determines whether one is Jewish. Jewishness is not based on language, territory, customs, and behavior. For most Russian and Ukrainian Jews, sentiment and biology have largely replaced faith, Jewish law and lore, and Jewish customs as the foundations of their self-conceptions as Jews. That runs up against the dominant conception in the diaspora, as we've been discussing last night and this morning, that somehow Jewishness is linked to Judaism. can debate how, but that there is some kind of historic or contemporary, personal or collective link is indubitable. Now, if Russian-speaking Jews are to be brought back in, to what are they being brought? To an ethnic group? To a nation? To a religion? The problem is most easily solved in Israel, where civic and national identity are assumed to be coterminous, though of course they are not, because 1 out of every 5 Israelis is not Jewish, and yet is Israeli. Immigrants from the USSR can immediately identify as Israeli citizens and as Jews in the Jewish state, with no reference necessary to Judaism. That cannot be done in Germany, in the United States, or anywhere outside of Israel. Thus, the conceptual challenge is how to accommodate one notion of being Jewish with another notion. Just as we talked about before, the notion of Jewishness as religion, the notion of Jewishness as ethnicity. For many of us, myself for example, there is no conflict whatsoever. For some, we choose one or the other and we see them in tension. But there is a greater boundary challenge posed by Jews from the FSU, manifesting itself both in Israel and in the diaspora. And that is the challenge of people who don't claim to be Jewish. This is an issue that has arisen, of course, in the West. In 1983, the Reform movement, I think to its regret, decided that patrilineal descent is sufficient to make one a Jew, and thereby separated itself from conservative and Orthodox Judaism, at least for the time being, and pushed the boundaries of the ethnic group further out than they had been. One Detroit temple put it in a Rosh Hashanah ad as follows: "We're in a Jewish, Italian, Korean family. What we look for in a temple is a place where everyone is treated the same, Jewish or non-Jewish. Nobody knows the difference or cares." About 2 weeks ago, the conservative movement announced that it would now, having rejected patrilineal Judaism, would now accept patrilineal Jewish kids to Camp Ramah for 1 year. And I suspect this is the beginning of yet another change within the conservative movement, ultimately to accept patrilineal Jewishness. Say, the ultimate boundary of Jewishness, the last line in the sand, used to be marriage to a non-Jew. Once one crossed that line, he or she was considered to have abandoned Judaism, the Jewish community, and any form of Jewish identity. This is simply no longer true in many Jewish circles. In 1999, BlueMountain.com, which at that time was the most visited greetings card site on the web, sent about 1 million holiday greeting cards, which were interfaith, blending Christmas and Hanukkah greetings. Christmas lights with stars of David, wreaths made of cloth printed with dreidels, angels with wings, halos, and dreidel print dresses were among other market responses to the erosion between Judaism and Christianity. And the term is what, David? Chrismuka. Now, outside Israel, the boundary issue manifests itself mostly in regard to non-Jewish spouses married to Jews, or self-identified Jews who are not halakhically Jewish, and at the margins, those who mix ethnic Jewishness with Christian beliefs, such as Hebrew Christians, Jews for Jesus, Messianic Jews, and so on. So we have boundary issues, disputes over inclusion and exclusion raging all over the world. Who is a rabbi? Is a rabbi a woman? Is a woman a rabbi? Is a gay a rabbi? One of the chuvas we've heard recently says, yes, but as long as you don't have anal intercourse. I don't know, my Zayda was a Rav, and every Friday women used to come to him with a chicken. She's kosher, this is treif. Azel Kashai was not gepasst. Such questions he didn't deal with. So we have a changing world. It's not something to be laughed at, and we address these kinds of issues. One Reconstructionist rabbi who has written a book on Messianic Jews writes very plaintively, "It's high time that together we figured out who we are." This is not together is an elusive, if not impossible, concept in a fractionated Jewish world. And figuring out, in the absence of either authoritative bodies or charismatic leaders anywhere in Israel or the diaspora, will not happen. But what about Israel? And this is the last point I want to make. In Israel, there are now at least 300,000 immigrants from the former Soviet Union who neither define themselves nor are defined by others as Jews. There are several 100,000, no one seems to know the correct number, of migrant workers, none of whom are Jews. Israel is a rapidly developing high-tech country, and in the highly unlikely possibility that some form of peace will descend on this arena, it's likely that many more non-Jews will come to Israel for business reasons and for other reasons. And what I'm saying is that already today, 300,000 out of 7 million, maybe if you include the migrant workers, potential long-term staying, 400,000, 500,000, is not an insignificant number. Where do they fit in? And that raises the issue, one of two, and Shlomo talked about the other one this morning, Israeli Arabs, that Israel has consistently swept under the rug since 1948. Is Israel an ethnic state or a civic state? Polska dla Polaków. Very clear. Poland is for the Poles. And if in the interwar period 1/3 of the Polish population was not Jewish, tough. And Belarusian was not Polish, I'm sorry. Jews, Belarusians, Lithuanians, Germans, they were second-class citizens. But Israel in Megillat HaAtzmaut, in the Declaration of Independence, says, it is the self-evident right of the Jewish people to be a nation like all other nations, K'chol HaGoyim, in its own sovereign state. Accordingly, we, the members of the National Council, representing the Jewish people in Palestine and the Zionist movement of the world, proclaim the establishment of the Jewish state in Palestine to be called Israel. And yet, 2 paragraphs later, we call upon the Arab inhabitants of the state of Israel to return to the ways of peace and play their part in the development of the state with full and equal citizenship and representation in all its bodies and institutions. We have a tension here, perhaps wisely avoided for pragmatic reasons for many decades, but I believe with the advent of more and more non-Jews as citizens of Israel, the question of Israel as an ethnic state or a civic state, and I believe this is a spectrum, this is not mutually exclusive, and here I take issue with Professor Walter last night, religion and ethnicity are also not separate. Think about Poland. Polak to jest katolik. A Pole is a Catholic. Is that empirically true? Not really, but that's the conception. In other words, there's a spectrum from Jewishness, which is a tribal religion, to a state which has no religious configuration, but as we heard this morning from Professor Jakobson, we have states which define themselves religiously, which we wouldn't ever think are defining themselves religiously. In other words, there's a spectrum of the relationship between religion and ethnicity, and that will exist in the state of Israel today. So, I leave you with a question. How will Israel deal with the non-Jews, first of all, from the Soviet Union, and with other categories from elsewhere? Who will be brought in, and who will not? Mi v'mi ha'holchim. Boundaries disputes and the blurring of boundaries may delight postmodernists, but they will be a source of constant strife and contention among Jews. Whom to bring in and whom not is on the diaspora Jewish agenda, and it may force itself onto the agenda of the Jewish state.
Thank you, Tzvi. And now, I don't know where the ex-Soviet Union is, in Europe or in Asia, but in any case, the next lecture will be by David Weinberg from Wayne State University. The third power, the attempts to develop a distinctive European Jewish identity after World War II. Professor Weinberg wrote a lot of very interesting researches, and I will mention only one of them or two of them, because, you know, for every of our speakers, if we will use all their publications, the most important even, it will take too much time. So we wrote of community in trial, the Jews of Paris in the 30s, Chaim Zetlovsky, Dubno, Fechad Ha'am, and the shaping modernity of Jewish identity. I think that is the most close to our topic. Please.
First, I wanted to echo the other speakers' comments about the delight and the honor it is to really participate in a conference honoring Gidi. Gidi has been a friend and a confidant for, I think, over 3 decades now. It's hard to believe, and so on. And his scholarly work and research continues to have a very significant impact on my own teaching and my own scholarship. So, again, thank you very much for inviting me. It should come as no surprise to learn that a recurrent theme in West European governmental circles after World War II was the need for rehabilitation. Yet the term signified more than merely physical and material reconstruction. Increasingly in the late 40s and early 50s, it also reflected the desire to reaffirm the place of a revitalized Europe in the world community. One could find a similar concern among British and West European Jews in response to the devastation of the Holocaust. And certainly historians have chronicled the untiring efforts by international and Jewish relief agencies to provide physical relief for European Jewry after 1945, as well as their support of the migration of tens of thousands of survivors to Palestine, America, and elsewhere. In so doing, however, they have all but ignored the attempts by the Jews of England and many of those who chose to remain on the continent to reassert their roles within their own countries and within world Jewry as a whole. The experience of the Holocaust had 2 vital repercussions on these Jews. First, it necessitated a rethinking of their relationship with their non-Jewish neighbors, many of whom had either participated in or had stood by while the Nazis carried out the final solution. To what extent, they wondered, could they still define themselves as members of European society? Second, much like Europe as a whole, the aftermath of the final solution led to the painful recognition that the Jews in Europe had lost their hegemonic status in the Jewish world, in part because of the significant loss of population due to both the Holocaust and immigration, in part because of the destruction of the cultural and religious centers of Eastern Europe. For most Jews in the new centers of Jewish life, be it the United States or Palestine, later Israel, the iconic image of the European Jew after 1945 was no longer the East European Rebbe or the wealthy West European entrepreneur, but the DP, the displaced person, the stateless individual who by definition was uprooted from his or her homeland in Europe and was unlikely to return. Yet while many Jews understandably turned their backs on their European roots, others sought to recover them. Already in the immediate post-war era, a group of young activists, primarily in Western Europe and in Great Britain, understood that if European Jewry was going to survive in any sense in a post-Holocaust world, there could be no simple return to pre-war attitudes and perceptions. Nazi ideology and policy had broken down many of the barriers between and within communities by transforming European Jewry into an undifferentiated collectivity marked for both physical death and historical oblivion. For those Jews who remained in Europe after the Holocaust, the challenge now became to transform what had been forcibly imposed from without into a willful identity and a shared future, albeit in a reduced population. The early voices calling for a new direction for the Jews of Europe were muted and often ignored in the immediate post-war period as communities concentrated on meeting their physical needs and as attention was primarily focused on the Yishuv. 2 decades later, however, the drive to create a distinctive European Jewish identity would gain new impotence as a result of a constellation of numerous factors, and I'll mention only a few in passing. The successful examples of the coordination by West European governments of their economic and military activity, the influx of immigrants to Europe that appeared to point toward a greater tolerance of minorities and in France at least toward the development of a multicultural society, the gradual strengthening of Jewish communal life, the withdrawal of support from American Jews, and the availability of reparations funds specifically geared to cultural, religious, and educational development. In turn, the growing exchange between British and continental Jewry in organizations like the European Executive of the much maligned World Jewish Congress, the gradual diminishing in divisions between Zionists and anti-Zionists that had often paralyzed communities in the pre-war and immediate post-war periods, and of course the increasing stabilization of Israel that allowed Jews in the diaspora to turn their attention to their own domestic concerns. The drive to define a distinctive path for European Jews would find a reflection in two movements in the 1960s and 1970s, one centering in France, the other in England, the two communities in the post-war period that showed the most promising signs of growth in Europe. Their proponents spoke boldly, however naively, of the need to create European Jewry as, quote, a third power, unquote. Their goal was to emphasize the importance of the continued presence of Jews on the continent that had been the locus of its greatest achievements and its most devastating persecution. The call for a new raison d'etre for the Jews in Europe in the 60s and 70s had its origins in the responses of community leaders and intellectuals to a series of challenges that they faced in the first 2 decades after the war. And I can only touch upon these challenges briefly in the course of my remarks this afternoon, or this morning. Even in the immediate post-war era of relief and recovery, one could already see at least some signs of European Jews asserting themselves. In this case, largely in response to the efforts by the Joint Distribution Committee and other organizations to reorganize and restructure European communal life. Given their dire straits in the immediate post-war era, European Jewish leaders were hardly in a position to offer any resistance to these initiatives. Nevertheless, they shared their frustration and anger with the often dismissive and condescending attitudes of their patrons, quote unquote. For many community leaders in Great Britain, France, and in the period up until 1947-48, Poland, interestingly enough, American Jews, however well-meaning, were boorish and lacked culture. It was one thing to provide monetary aid, they argued. It was quite another for a community without a history to attempt to recreate European Jewry in its own image. As a British rabbi stated at a conference organized by the World Jewish Congress in '53, quote, "Do you believe that you can argue that from New York comes Torah and the Word of God from San Francisco?" Officials of the JDC in particular were hardly pleased with such responses, yet in ways that they could not always clearly recognize, the various programs devised by the Joint, first on its own and later as an agency of the Claims Conference, to streamline and coordinate European Jewish social services, cultural and educational programming and fundraising, contributed to the growing self-confidence of the Jews of Western Europe and Great Britain by increasing the links among them and by deepening their sense of a shared fate and destiny. The second major challenge that led to a reassessment of the situation of European Jewry was, of course, the establishment of the State of Israel. For the first time in modern history, Jews could choose whether or not to live in the diaspora. The writings of Arthur Koestler in the late 1940s, which would be re-echoed in the 1960s by Georges Friedman, questioning the continued existence of the diaspora, forced European Jewish community leaders and intellectuals to examine their reasons for remaining in their homelands. What slowly emerged was an affirmation of the historic ties between Jews and the European continent that many thought should be maintained. The third challenge, or a third challenge, was the advent of the Cold War. Though dividing European Jewry into two in a very brutal way, it also heightened the desire by its leading elements in the West to find common ground with their co-religionists behind the Iron Curtain. At the same time, in refusing to totally succumb to the ideological demands of either local communists or American Jewish officials, they crafted their own distinctive positions on such issues as German rearmament and the prosecution of German war criminals. A fourth challenge was cultural and religious reconstruction. The tragic loss of the educational religious elite throughout Europe and the unique challenges offered by a generation of survivors that had largely been removed from Jewish communal life during the Holocaust necessitated the introduction of new and distinctive religious and pedagogical perspectives and programs that reinforced the desire to ensure the future of the individual communities. The proponents of this new Jewish Europe in the late 1940s and early 1950s were a varied group. Its most vocal advocates on the continent were young activists who had participated in national resistance efforts during the war. Young intellectuals in Great Britain also played a significant role. Of special importance were the elements within the British reform and liberal movements. For these individuals, who were spared the ravages of the Holocaust, the English Channel was not a divide that separated them from Europe, but rather a constant reminder of how perilously close they came to sharing the fate of their fellow co-religionists on the continent. Many of these individuals could be found among the tens of thousands of refugees from Germany and Eastern Europe who came to the British shores after 1945. Strongly tied to the continent, they were instrumental in creating ties between England and the rest of Europe. In France, the call for a revitalized Jewish presence in Europe would be taken up in the late 60s and early 70s by disillusioned activists who were increasingly troubled by the emergence of anti-Semitism on the left. Committed to remaining in Europe, they found an answer in the notions of cultural autonomy originally formulated by Austrian socialists and Polish and Russian Jewish militants. Here, too, I might note, the role of immigrants and refugees was significant, especially from Eastern Europe. Through the writings and pronouncements of these individuals, the vague and tentative intimations of European Jewish future evoked in the immediate post-war period became a bold assertion of distinctiveness. And I turn to the two manifestations of this assertion in the 1960s and 70s. The first was what has generally been known as neo-Bundism, and its focus and locus was France. The proponents of this perspective saw themselves as standing between Western assimilationism and what they defined as Zionist isolationism. Drawing heavily from the writings of Shimon Dubnov, they emphasized the centrality of the European experience. They rediscovered Bundist writings and stressed the notion of dualism, the belief that Jewish faith lay in the diaspora, in the general struggle for progressive ideals. The key work in this movement was Robert Marienstrass' Être juif en diaspora, to be a Jew in the diaspora. Marienstrass himself was an immigrant from Poland who had arrived in France as a child. A ringing defense of the continued Jewish presence in Europe and in France in particular, his book trumpeted the virtues of cultural autonomy. Marienstrass founded Le Cercle Gaston Crémieux in 1967, and along with a group of about 150 students and professors, they studied Jewish history from the perspective of Dubnov and looked for ways to develop a secular Jewish culture in France. They also encouraged Jews to seek ethnic autonomy in a joint political effort with other minorities. They sponsored events to introduce France to the accomplishments of a secular Jewish culture outside of Israel. In addition to study groups in Jewish history, they held classes in Yiddish, Jewish cooking, and workshops to discuss what it meant to be a Jew in the diaspora. Though stressing the importance of Yiddish, the group endorsed efforts to promote Ladino and other Jewish languages in the diaspora. The Cercle Gaston Crémieux ceased to exist in 1985, though individuals, members like Rachel Hertel and Marienstrass, continue to work and publish. Today, a few echoes remain. Recently, there has been a renewed interest in the concept of cultural autonomy in Europe, fueled, of course, by the influx of immigrants, primarily from Arab and Muslim areas. And I refer to the recent position paper by the Institute for Jewish Policy Research in London, suggesting at least that Jews should define themselves as an ethnic group in a multicultural society. One may also point to the example of Sweden, which has granted its Jewish citizens status as one of 5 national minorities. Yet for the most part, the notion of cultural autonomy did not take root in post-war Europe, post-war Jewish Europe. Jews of Western Europe and Great Britain have chosen to integrate into society and are not interested in what one critic disparagingly described as, quote, a return to the ghetto, unquote. The second and more important manifestation of the development of a distinctive European Jewish identity can be found in the pages of the journal European Judaism, which is published in London beginning in the mid-1960s, still exists today, with contributions from Jewish intellectuals throughout England, Western and Central Europe. For supporters of this journal, the notion of a distinctive European Jewish identity rested on 2 interconnected claims. First, a rejection of the notion that European Jewry was dead. The editorial in the first issue, published in 1966, clearly outlined this perspective. Neither the Holocaust nor Israel had ended Jewish life in Europe, it pronounced. about 20% of the original population of Europe remained, quote, to face the future, unquote. In some countries, such as France, there was a high proportion that survived. While in Britain, the community was totally spared, even Russian Jewry survives, it maintained. The editorial spoke hopefully of immigration from North Africa and the Middle East to the European continent. It even noted that there was a chance of a limited return to Europe of Jews who had emigrated after the war to currently troubled areas such as South Africa and South America. For the supporters of European Judaism, that is, of the journal European Judaism, Jews continued to be intimately bound up with the history of Europe, having lived in Europe longer than many of the so-called indigenous ethnic groups. Europe, which left so much of her art and philosophy, culture and life, the editorial comment was, quote, a lasting possession in the Jewish soul, a mother who still has something left to offer her children, unquote. The second concept or perspective was the need for the development of a new basis for European Jewish thought and culture. The view of European Judaism in a fairly early stage, interestingly enough, was predicated on the assumption that the major threat to Jewish life was not anti-Semitism, of course, but assimilation. It's a fairly early perspective. In the face of the growing alienation of young European Jews, its editors proclaimed there was a need to create a new basis for Jewish identity. Yet in seeking to find an appropriate method to counter the danger, European Jewish leaders could no longer rely upon the destroyed East European Jewish religious culture. In view of the editors, the Holocaust was a watershed that signaled the end of the dominance of Orthodoxy. At the same time, it claimed it opened up an opportunity for the revival of quote-unquote progressive forms of Jewish thought, which at least in Europe had been temporarily weakened by the destruction of German Jewry. The journal stressed the unique ability of the Reform movement with its emphasis upon the value of interaction with non-Jews, its reliance upon reason, and its openness to new ideas to appeal to alienated Jews. Not surprisingly, therefore, the journal called upon largely secular intellectuals estranged from religious establishment to voice their ideas about the fate of European Jewry. In its more dreamy moments, it voiced the hope that the return of prodigal sons and daughters could provide the foundation of a new spiritual leadership, grounded in intellect, grounded in reason. This perspective culminated in the notion of European Jewry as a third power between America and Israel. And so much of this early identification was an identification based on what they were not, rather than a real understanding of what they were. It's very typical, I think, of identity formation in its early stages or in its reassertions. For the proponents of a distinctive European Jewish identity, American Jewry represented the spirit of individualism and materialism, which prevented the pursuit of intellectual life, the core of Jewish culture, according to this perspective. In turning to Israel, supporters of the third power, as it was called, spoke in familiar diasporous terms. And interesting to note them as late the 1970s and 1980s. Though not opposed to the Zionist effort, they argued that Israel reflected Jewish isolationism, a rejection of the ability of Jews to intermingle with their non-Jewish neighbors to further the interests of humanity as a whole. European Jewry, therefore, was a third power because as a community forced to totally renew itself, it could learn from the failures and the successes of both the American and the Israeli communities. Obviously, this was a perspective that was riddled with problems and weaknesses. And despite the optimistic mood expressed in the essays in European Judaism throughout the late 60s and into the 1970s, the editors faced great difficulties disseminating their views. In many cases, they were met with little response and at times even open hostility. And this was most clearly evident, at least as I viewed it, in the general failure to win over French Jewish leaders, very important second pillar of this perspective, British and French Jews. The general impression one comes away with from reading the issue devoted to French Jewry in the winter of 1967, for example, is that the French community was too caught up in its own internal problems, and in particular dealing with the influx of North African Jews, to spend much time pondering about trans-European Jewish identity. Indeed, the opposite appeared to be the case. Articles by French Jewish rabbis and intellectuals in the issue reflecting a growing fear that the French Jewish community was becoming less European as a result of the North African influx rather than more European. There was a similar myopia vis-a-vis European Jewry, East European Jewry. proponents of the third power are convinced that their notion of a unified European Jewry would have special appeal to East European Jewish communities in the future. In their view, these communities, once liberated from the communist yoke, would naturally gravitate toward liberal forms, modern forms, quote unquote, of Jewish communal and religious life. The reality, as we know, would prove far different. A second problem or weakness was even more problematic. As Professor Eliezer Schweid remarked in a letter written in 1967, in response to a request by the journal's editors to offer his thoughts on their enterprise, how realistic and relevant was the concept of European Jewry as a distinctive and totally separate entity in the post-war world? After all, did the concept of European Jewry ever exist? And weren't post-war European Jewish communities as transplanted as American and Israeli Jewry? Equally important, Schweid noted, it was never terribly clear just what the proponents of the third power meant by the terms European and Jewish. For most of the contributors, he suggested, it was a particular reading of German Jewish religious thought that seemed to embody the essence of European Jewish culture. I might also note that for the Neo-Buntists, of course, it was the exact opposite, a borrowing from East European Jewish culture. A third weakness, and final point I want to make, of course, is highlighted by that ever-perplexing postmodernist question about the process of self-fashioning, both individual and collective. The proponents of a distinctive European Jewish identity were convinced that the challenge was to fix an identity that had allegedly been shattered, even destroyed by the Holocaust. The reality, of course, is that Jewish identity, like all identities, is fluid, reflecting a negotiation between an imagined past, a hopeful future, and an experienced present. At best, as Jonathan Weber has rightly remarked, one can talk about Jewish identities in Europe, not a singular identity. One can see the weaknesses of the early view by contrasting the views of the editors of European Judaism with the proponents of European Jewish distinctiveness today. There's a recent book, not a terribly successful one, I might add, called Turning the Kaleidoscope, which deals with this very issue of a third pillar, as it's called, of the distinctiveness of European Jewry. But it's interesting to note that the editors of this volume admit that, quote, today it is virtually impossible to identify a specific mode of being a European Jew, much less a specifically European Judaism, unquote. In contrast to the Neo-Bundists and the circle around European Judaism in the 60s and 70s, from whom I think they borrow a great deal, today's defenders of a Jewish Europe view the question of identity as a work in progress rather than a clearly defined given. Even Diana Pinto, one of its most articulate defenders in France today, is forced to recognize in this volume that, quote, European Jews are the only ones who conjugate their verbs in the future to perpetuate Jewry in Europe, unquote. This might be seen in the good old American terms as a cop-out, maybe not. With hindsight, it's easy to dismiss the attempts by early proponents of a distinctive European Jewish identity in the 60s and 70s as rather marginal, and certainly as naive and unrealistic. Nevertheless, long before most Jews in the United States, at least, those who thought seriously about European Jewish life in the post-war era were led to seriously reassess the significance of living in the diaspora. They consciously rejected, for better or for worse, the dual alienation implied in the term diaspora. They were neither exiled from their homeland nor marginalized within the societies in which they lived. In so doing, proponents of European Jewish revival in the first 3 decades after World War II not only signaled the readiness of the Jews of Europe, of at least England and Western Europe, to rejoin other diaspora communities in their ongoing efforts to maintain Jewish identity and commitment in an open society, but they also helped in their own way, I think, to contribute to the contemporary understanding of a multi-centric world Jewry. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And you are all of the time. I want to be tough, but I'm not able always. So, Kimmy Caplan from Bar-Ilan. As I understand, he will speak or we will talk about orthodoxy in the New World, more or less, and in Israel. It's true?
More or less.
More or less.
Good afternoon. Unlike the two who spoke before me, I don't know Gitelman for 30 years. One of the points that
It's not
reappeared...
so old.
No, I'm young, not him. One of the points that reappears in several articles in the book Zionism and its Jewish Opponents, edited by Gidi Shimoni and Chaim Avni, is the influence that Zionism's opponents had on the way Zionist ideologies were formulated. In other words, Zionist ideologists were influenced no less by the discourse held between pro and anti-Zionists, no less than that held between pro-Zionists and themselves. Gidon Shimoni developed this notion much further in his outstanding and impressive book, The Zionist Ideology. In one of his closing remarks to the book, Zionism and its Jewish Opponents, Shmuel Ettinger bemoans the ideological decline in the Zionist movement, which he claims is evident in the fact that this movement does not have original thinkers and new leaders, and that its challenges and modes of thought relate to the past and not to the future. In the following presentation, I would like to point to certain popular developments that are occurring within mainstream Israeli Haredi society since the 1970s, and suggest that they uncover the existence of a process of, quote, Israelization within this society. This does not apply to extreme Haredi groups, such as the Eda Haredit or our 6 brothers who recently visited Tehran, even though among them we find interesting developments as well, and it clearly stands in contrast with the anti-Zionist Haredi ideology, as well as the moderate Haredi ideological stand vis-a-vis Zionism. While the significant gaps between these indications and Haredi official ideologies could be explained by the irrelevance of the ideology as a result of lack of updating, as Ettinger suggested, in the Zionist sphere, it leads to a surprising process in the opposite direction, namely the convergence of Haredim towards Zionist icons, the State of Israel, and non-religious identities. I admittedly owe the idea of approaching the topic from the point of view of the relationship between ideology and day-to-day life to Gidon Shimoni. Rabbi Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik, known as Revelvo, was appointed Rabbi of Brisk in 1918, and in 1939, following the Nazi occupation of Poland, he escaped to Vilna, and 2 years later he relocated to Jerusalem. Soloveitchik rejected all offers for an official rabbinical position within Israeli Haredi society, but his authority and influence were immeasurable, especially after the death of Rabbi Avraham Yeshayahu Karelitz, the Chazon Ish, in 1953. The story goes, and keep in mind that many Haredi leaders said much more after their death than during their lifetime, that Soloveitchik saw a Haredi Jew taking an active part in a demonstration against the State of Israel, and told him that, quote, "You are a Zionist." Startled, terrified, and taken by surprise, the Haredi responded by asking how could the rabbi accuse him of being a Zionist while he is busy demonstrating against the Zionist state. The nature of Soloveitchik's reply was as follows: if you demonstrate against it, it must bother you. If it bothers you, you're influenced by it. If you're influenced by it, you're part of it. In other words, someone who expresses feelings of love or hate towards someone or something indicates that he or she are not ambivalent or indifferent toward them. Israeli Haredim, who are approximately 7 to 10% of Israel's population, maintain a tense love-hate relationship with Israeli society, a relationship which has gradually intensified over the last generation. One of its main expressions is the growing exposure of mainstream Haredim to Israeli society in general. Consequently, they are becoming more acquainted with Israeli society's various social and cultural components. These mainstream Haredim are undergoing a process of Israelization since the mid-1970s, both consciously and unconsciously. Several indications of this process appear in the sphere of popular religion, which in this case study has been checked thus far among mainstream Ashkenazim. The term mainstream relates to the vast majority of the Lithuanian Mitnagdim and the main Hasidic courts that are part of Agudat Israel. Both blocks constitute certainly over 90% of Haredim in Israel. This process of Israelization can be characterized in terms of integration without assimilation. Most studies on Israeli Haredim, until quite recently, focus on the counterculture and segregating aspects of this community. For example, Menachem Friedman shows time and again in a most persuasive way that Israeli Haredi society held and continues to hold an ongoing relationship with the institutions of the Zionist movement during the period of the British Mandate in Palestine, and more so with the State of Israel in its first years and later. Furthermore, by providing crucial financial support, the State of Israel enabled Haredi society to rebuild itself after the Holocaust and develop. However, for several decades, most Ashkenazi Haredim did not show any sign of integration into Israeli society. I beg to differ by suggesting that there is another somewhat contradicting process simultaneously that we must consider. There are numerous indications of this process of integration, such as the common use of modern Hebrew language among Ashkenazi Haredim with a clear Israeli slant. Many Haredi women, and more so in recent years, are working in non-Haredi environments with all the influences that come with them. Growing numbers of Haredim attend museums and places which were and still are perceived by Haredim as icons of Israeli society and Zionism. Examples include Yad Vashem, the Museum of the Jewish Diaspora at Tel Aviv University, Haganah, Etzel and Lehi museums, army bases open to the public on Israel's Independence Day, the Safari in Ramat Gan, shopping malls in non-Haredi areas, and the National Library in Jerusalem. But it is not only consumption of leisure culture. Growing involvement in Israeli society can be also seen in Haredi organized events, even though these tend to project anti-Israeli feelings. For example, in recent years, Haredi society held several massive demonstrations, among them one against the Supreme Court, and a few smaller ones protesting against the economic reforms executed by former Finance Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, which includes measurable cuts in child allowance paid by the state per child. Alongside protest and feelings of alienation, these demonstrations denote the Haredi partial acceptance of what we would call the rules of the Israeli game, assuming there are rules, and their self-perception that they are full citizens with a right to influence government policies. Let me remind you, the big demonstrations in the 40s, 50s, and late 40s, 50s, and 60s in Kikar Shabbat were to do with Shabbat, kashrut, observance of dietary law, and the like. No one protested on other issues of the kind that I mentioned. The process of Israelization has various indications in the realm of Haredi popular religion, and it is not led by Haredi religious elite. In fact, for the most part, it is happening against the will of Haredi religious leadership. In addition, some have argued that this process can be traced among Haredi politicians and the conduct of Haredi political parties, especially since the early 1990s. But this does not necessarily indicate that something is occurring among rank-and-file Haredim. In order to clarify this important aspect, let us consider in most general terms two popular topics that have a significant presence in the internal discourse within Israeli Ashkenazi Haredi society since the late 1960s, the repentance movement and the contemporary Haredi confrontations with the Holocaust. Overall, it is important to begin by noting that Haredi perceptions of the repentance movement are based primarily upon their analysis of historical and social developments which Israeli society underwent. This leads them to focus on various watershed events in the history of Israel, primarily the Six-Day War and the Yom Kippur War, and their consequences. In other words, those involved in this movement have gained a wealth of knowledge regarding Israel's history. Considering repentance as a widespread social phenomenon, referring to it in figures of 6 and even 7 digits, these numbers are rather problematic, I must say, leads many Haredi institutions and individuals that have connections with repenters to be acquainted with the ins and outs of contemporary Israeli society and culture. By acquiring knowledge about the, quote, secular Israeli world, those involved in this endeavor better understand why people are leaving secular life and opting for a Haredi alternative, and what kind of lifestyle and spirituality they are seeking. Furthermore, treating this as a phenomenon exposes the average Haredi to a great deal more of Israeli society than he would otherwise not have been aware of, since some of those returning to the faith are very popular speakers among Haredi audiences, primarily in the context of telling their life stories. By being there and discovering the truth, these returnees not only strengthen Haredim, that their lifestyle is the most meaningful and spiritually fulfilling, but also expose them to a great deal of information regarding Israeli society. This in addition to numerous books, audio tapes, and other publications which address repenters but are widely read by Haredim from birth. The average Haredi listening to former popular Israeli figures such as Uri Zohar, Noah Yaon, Pupik Arnon, or the late Alona Einstein learns a great deal about the other's lifestyle, culture, and language, notwithstanding the fact that they are presented in a negative light. The fact that these popular speakers rarely stop to explain Israeli expressions or set the ground for certain detailed descriptions taken from the Israeli non-Haredi context when speaking to Haredi audiences is the best proof of the level of knowledge of the average listener. To be sure, certain knowledge might be expectable, but why, for example, should we expect the average Haredi to be acquainted with Israeli army vocabulary, slang, codes, and abbreviations? As a result of this process, as a widespread social phenomenon, as a result of regarding this process as a widespread social phenomenon, manuals and guideline books are published and seminars are conducted for those who wish to return to the faith. Several relatively recent publications of this nature expose us to the problems, difficulties, and aspirations that the repenting individual encounters in this long and ever-challenging process. These materials include a shrewd and sophisticated understanding of Israeli secular life and culture. It is certainly not stereotypical and does not see secular life and culture as being all negative and irrelevant to the new identity that this repenter adopted. As Yehuda Grunwald, an attorney who repented close to 20 years ago, concludes in his widely read guidebook for repenters, quote, "We should bear in mind, well, that our past is not only a collection of sins, but also a receptacle of abundant life experiences that can sometimes be very useful to us in the service of God." This approach leads Grunwald to reject drastic actions by repenters, just like throwing their guitars and the like, opposing their understandable tendency to disregard all aspects of their former life, and has direct implications on a host of issues that the repentant faces, such as his or her relationship with his or her parents, immediate and extended family, his or her children's education, creating a balance between learning and working, and rejecting any form of drastic, irreversible acts. To the best of my knowledge, this sophisticated attitude is gradually replacing the dominant approach of categorically rejecting the secular past, which was more common among Haredi repentance activists in the 1960s and 1970s. Grunwald's approach, which is quite representative of Haredi activists during the last generation, demands a complex and sensitive understanding of secular life and culture and an appreciation for its positive values from a Haredi point of view. Assuming this analysis is correct, one might yet argue that knowledge obtained and utilized by those involved in repentance does not necessarily reach the average person. For this reason, we will briefly address another topic: contemporary Ashkenazi confrontations with the Holocaust. The Holocaust is arguably the most sensitive and painful theological, historical issue that Ashkenazi Haredim are confronting since 1945, just like millions of Jews and other non-Jews around the world. Dealing with an ultra-conservative society and a very sensitive topic, we would assume that there would be very little place for different voices. In fact, the most striking finding is the existence of a wide-range polyphony of voices on this topic. Over the last 20 years, we are witnessing a tremendous increase in both quantity and variety of Haredi popular culture on the Holocaust. This material, widely distributed throughout all sectors of Haredi society, includes popular books, newspaper articles, sermons, lectures, and children's literature. Behind a significant portion of this literature, we find many local rabbis, preachers, and educators who are in their 60s at the most. They belong to the second, sometimes third generation, who, if at all, were either born or young, very young children or infants during the Holocaust. Some of them were born and raised in Israel, and their immediate families were not affected by the events in Europe. It would be impossible to go into endless details, but attention should be drawn to a few preliminary conclusions which bear upon our argument. 1. Several leading Haredi figures, such as Rabbi Shach in Israel and Rabbi Hutner in America, objected to discussing the Holocaust as well as using the term Shoah. Using a special term, they argued, implies that this was a unique event in Jewish history, and therefore we are in need for new theological concepts in order to deal with it. Notwithstanding this authoritative approach, all those who relate to the Holocaust in Haredi society over the last 20 years use the term Shoah, and some make an effort to explain why indeed it is a unique event in Jewish history. 2. The strong Haredi tendency to blame Zionism, the Zionist movement, and the Yishuv leadership for the Holocaust and for purposefully not saving European Jews has been well documented by Menachem Friedman and Dina Porat. These accusations were central in almost all parts of mainstream Ashkenazi Haredi society in Israel in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, but much less so since the 1980s. 3. Several Haredi writers tend to avoid discussing the possible theological explanations for the Holocaust, which were central in Haredi society, such as that of reward and punishment. One of the main reasons for this shift is the exposure of these authors and educators to academic works on the Holocaust. This exposure varies greatly from author to author, but unlike 25 or more years ago, academic sources are cited openly, even though not always accurately. Furthermore, although scholarly works are occasionally used and misused by Haredi writers for their ideological purposes, and at times cited out of context, we nevertheless find that they are influenced by these academic sources. The most striking influence lays in the fact that some Haredi writers accept the factual level and description of events and processes as they are set forth by scholars, and incorporate the complexity of the social historical reality of the Second World War into their writings. For example, in a book which appeared in 1989, dealing with the Zionist leadership's conduct during the Holocaust, the author, Moshe Vazelman, from the Mitnagdik Lithuanian camp, spells out his main conclusion in his introduction as follows. This accusation is not a total accusation against these Zionist leaders claiming that they could have saved it all, since the results of the general battlefields in Europe are known. The "I accuse" that arises from our research, he uses the word research, is that even in the places and cases where individuals or groups could have been rescued, also then all initiative and ability disappeared and were replaced by apathy, standing arms folded, indifference, and standing aloof. This relative tone originates from the historical understanding that the Yeshuv's leadership was a marginal force in the Second World War, and therefore could have done very little to save Jews to begin with. It differs from the direct and fierce accusations dominant in most Haredi circles until the late 1970s, best represented in the publications of Rabbi Weissmandel and Moshe Schoenfeld, according to which the Yeshuv's leadership did nothing to save the European brethren as part of a grand plan to enhance their Zionist ideology, and collaborated with the Nazis, no less, in order to exterminate what they considered the ultimate diaspora Jews in the negative sense of the term. How did Vazelman obtain his historical perspective on the Yeshuv's leadership, which resulted in a relative tone which is not uniquely Haredi? His answer is clear from reading Dina Poat's book, Hanaga B'Milkud, which appeared in 1986 on the Yeshuv's leadership during the Holocaust. Finally, the exposure to the complexity of the historical reality and events has important implications on the popular Haredi theological discussion regarding the Holocaust. For example, there seems to be an inverse correlation between the degree of recognition vis-à-vis the complexity of the reality and talk on the Holocaust in terms of reward and punishment. When one of them goes up, the other goes down. It seems as though the acquaintance with the complex reality during the Holocaust leads inevitably to a degree of specification regarding reward and punishment which will always leave unanswered questions. When the endless details and contradicting facts and fates are not taken into account, it is easier to supply a wholesome theological explanation for the Holocaust. Haredi historiographers have ideological and educational agendas which relate primarily to present-day dilemmas in their society. Therefore, certain issues are intentionally overlooked, whereas others are taken out of context and twisted. For example, until today, even those who write in a very complex way about the Holocaust have a very big problem writing about how those few Admorim, Hasidic leaders who left Eastern Europe, how indeed they did so. A few years ago, there was an article in Der Yid, or a series of articles. Der Yid is the Satmar weekly, which appears in New York, in Yiddish, about the Nes Hatzalat HaAdmor Misatmar, the miraculous saving of the Satmar leader, Rabbi Teitelbaum. Every detail is there accurate. Where he went from where to where, except for one, Kastner's train is not mentioned. Also, a lot of the writings about the Belzer Rebbe who came out and subsequently, after going through Budapest and the whole story, I won't go into the whole thing, entered into Palestine through Haleb in Syria with a Zionist certificate supplied by Rabbi Herzog at the time. You will read very accurate descriptions about his whole path through Eastern Europe. but no mention in many sources of how he actually got into Palestine. This does not overshadow the exposure to academic scholarship and its partial acceptance, especially in such a sensitive topic as the Holocaust. It may be argued that this trend does not indicate anything about Haredi becoming more Israeli due to the nature of scholarship and historical research. However, we should keep in mind that some of these Haredi authors and their audience tend to perceive Yehuda Bauer, Israel Gutman, Dina Porat, and a few other people who are part of them are sitting here, as something very Israeli and pro-Zionist, certainly when dealing with the Holocaust. I'm not saying it's correct, that's their perception. Haredi popular historiography of the Holocaust is a different sphere than the repentance movements, but they both indicate a certain dialogue with Israeli society and its values, certainly from a Haredi point of view, and at times an appreciation of some of Israeli society's components. Numerous scholars and students of contemporary Jewish religious trends and communities point one way or another to the ways in which Jewish communities are influenced by their social and cultural surrounding societies. This is equally true of Orthodox and Haredi communities, as several historians and sociologists have shown. In other words, American Haredim have internalized certain aspects of American culture and leisure habits, and the same can be accounted for regarding Australian, Belgian, British, French, and Swiss Haredim. Therefore, why would Haredim in Israel be different to begin with? Primarily because both sociological and historical works on Israeli Haredi society show how, although Haredim are connected to the state of Israel on a very instrumental and technical level since the early years of the state, they nevertheless created a strong counterculture, an ideological and theological opposition to Zionism and the state of Israel, or at least adopted an ambivalent approach. They certainly rejected any situation in which they felt that socio-cultural ideas and behaviors might possibly infiltrate their society. Furthermore, from a comparative perspective, this case is similar to Islamic fundamentalist groups in Arab countries on the one hand, and Islamic communities in exile or diaspora, such as the United States, Britain, and France on the other hand. Overall, the Islamic communities living in non-Islamic countries and societies understand that this is a temporary situation, even though it may last for many years. They are guests in someone else's homeland and do not have demands regarding the local political system or the non-Islamic public sphere. And here I admittedly think that Emmanuel Sivan's approach outweighs that of Robert Wistrich. However, the story in Egypt, Sudan, and Algiers is quite different. Islamic fundamentalists perceive these countries as their homeland, and they are fighting fiercely for changing their national and public characters. Without disregarding basic differences, this is the case of the Haredim in Israel. Haredim living in the Jewish diaspora understand that they are guests in their respective countries, whereas those living in Israel perceive it as their homeland, a land which is loaded with religious significance and importance and therefore demands strict behavioral rules. Consequently, Haredim in Israel perceive themselves as being in a far more delicate and potentially dangerous situation with regard to the surrounding society since it is Jewish. Keeping these issues in mind, the process of Israelization within Israeli Haredi society should not be taken for granted. Be it as it may, this process of Israelization is subject to ongoing internal Haredi debates, dilemmas and negotiations within the various mainstream Haredi groups with regard to the question of the affordable prices of this process. For example, in recent years, we evidence a trend of return to Yiddish in kindergartens and schools among mainstream Hasidic groups such as GUL. In the case of GUL, it is particularly interesting since the first leader of this Hasidic court in Palestine adopted, starting the early 1920s, a pro-Hebrew stand with regard to the language used in GUR's educational institutions, as a result of the recognition that Hebrew is the prime language in pre-state Jewish society in Palestine. In conclusion, should this description and analysis regarding mainstream Haredim have some merit, it is not the first process of its kind. It happened several decades ago in a completely different context within the Reform movement, and subsequently led it to reconsider and completely change its ideological approach towards Zionism. In other words, mainstream Israeli Haredi society is at a partially similar point to that of the Reform movement stood several decades ago. A gap between communities and individuals and the movement's ideology. Now, I'm not trying to, the Haredi won't like the comparison either with the Reform movement, but if we look at processes, I think we have to be fair. Be it as it may, it seems as though we are facing popular phenomena and leisure culture which may suggest that mainstream Haredim are more exposed to Israeli society in the last generation than we tend to think, and that they are possibly partially internalizing some of its values, although not always consciously. Presenting preliminary observations leave us with far more questions and problems, as well as the challenge of situating them within the context of the various socio-cultural tribes that compose contemporary Israeli society. Notwithstanding all these challenges, it seems as though one conclusion is unquestionable. Rabbi Yitzchak Zev Soloveitchik would have been a lone ranger in contemporary Israeli Haredi society more than he probably would have ever anticipated. Thank you.
Thank you. Gidi? No? You have a priority once. Please, questions, comments, and so on, please.
Common question to say that other people. Common question to Sven Gitelman that others might want to comment as well, to throw in another element to what is Jewish identity in a multicultural society. Sven, when you listed the world bodies of the Jewish world and the amorphous nature of that, you left out JDC, yet you did refer to JDC later on as others. So my question is, the role of tzedakah, if we're looking at what is Jewish identity, is it ethnicity, is it religion, the issue of the tzedakah and that every Jew is responsible for other Jews, Yehudi, Arabim, Zeh Lezeh, and the role that the joint has played worldwide, including Australia, which is where I'm from, that hasn't yet been put onto the table, so I'd like to ask about that. Just a brief comment. We did carry out a survey recently in Australia about Russian, Israeli and South African Jewish identities, because they're the three major groups. And the findings have been really interesting, how each group has quite a different definition of its Jewishness, and I do think these issues need to be taken up a lot more seriously by the Jewish educational world. Thank you.
Well, please. Yeah.
Different, okay.
Okay.
Comment and question to Kimmy,
You
Caplan.
need this?
No, okay. I'd like to support your observations from also personal observations, traveling with family every summer up north to the Galilee and being astonished in the last 5 years how most of the people in the national parks are Haredi groups who you never saw there before, hiking in through the pools and so on, as a sign. But I'd like your comment on, in terms of the larger families now and economic factors, how that might affect the future trend of Haredis getting absorbed into Israeli society or not.
Who else, please?
Well, apropos of that question, the recent
Yes.
storm about the Not-Yaakov,
Yes.
And-
That too.
incredibly, just not opening the school year for months. Unheard of idea, right?
Okay.
Question to Professor Weinberg. I missed in your excellent lecture the role of the fast-growing German, Russian Jewish community.
Who else, please?
Kimmy, Caplan, I think you left out the part about the real difference about the Haredi community in Israel as opposed to the Haredi community in America, Canada, and whatever, and that's the army.
That is?
The army.
Army. You finished with the army, please.
I came a bit late, perhaps you spoke about this. Of the Altshulas in the Haredi movement, do they suddenly question the authority of the so-called Gitelman when they do terrible things, like the persecution of Rabbi Slifkin for claiming the world is 15 billion years old and so forth this past year, Rabbi Yosef destroyed the prenuptial agreements worked out by the rabbis of the state, and so forth. Coming from a background where they don't just listen, but where they think about things critically, does this tend to bring about an inner rebellious force among the Haredim of people who question the Gedolim? And of course, the fact that the Haredim speak Hebrew now mostly is a tremendous achievement. Yeah.
I do have a question, Mike. To which extent are there marriages between Chosrei B'Tshuva and the Haredim by historically? Please.
Mordechai, Dalia.
I want to take to relate to the issue of ethnic identity in Israel that Jewry raised. I want to relate to Smocha's analysis of Israeli democracy, and he defined it as an ethnic democracy. He also has a range of, a more meshupar, better kind of improved democracy or less improved democracy. And he certainly relates to the state of Israel as an ethnic democracy, with a lot of criticism the way its policies is to the Arab minority. But when we are looking at the non-Jews who immigrated from Russia, from the ex-Soviet Union to Israel, and their approach and their attitude towards being integrated in the Israeli society, I think whether they are Jews or non-Jews, whether they would
What
convert...
does it mean, Jews?
What?
What does it mean, Jews?
Well, the citizens of Israel who did not declare themselves as non-Jews, I mean, they are Jews, okay? Let me take this general definition. The integration of school, language, culture, is a process that is happening there and will happen, and when we think of a next generation of the children, etc., they will be part, and they are part of the army, and I think Alex said it yesterday in a comment to Michael Walzer. But the Arab minority, in contrast, although they will quote the Bible, as it was mentioned this morning in one of the comments, they want to be Arabs, and this is a kind of a national minority that would like to have its place in a democratic ethnic state. And this is a problem that we have to accommodate while thinking of a Jewish state and a democratic state. And I think that Smocha really opens up this issue very well.
I would steer clear of, I have a very simple response to a very simple question, why I did not deal with German and Russian Jewish communities. And very simple reason, and that's because I was mainly interested in the genesis of the movement, which is in the 60s and 70s. You're absolutely right. If I were to bring this up into the 90s and beyond, I would certainly have to include the German Jewish community, which is a very important element in this, and to some extent increasingly the Russian community. But that was not my concern. It was really a historical analysis.
Sure. I'll answer two questions. One was about the Joint Distribution Committee, which, by the way, its full name is the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee, and that's not accidental. The Joint makes no claim to be representative of world Jewry. It serves world Jewry. The interesting point, I think, and the one that you made, is that the activities of the Joint, which are very much supported by a large number of people, do signal, through tzedakah, do signal that there still remains a sentiment of mutual belonging among world Jews. The Joint has worked very hard, however, and it has done so for many decades, to produce successive generations of Jews who feel that mutuality and common identity with Jews all over the world. It does not happen. It does not happen accidentally. And given today's Jewry, the younger generations, who learn rather by seeing and feeling than by reading, The Joint has very successfully taken missions to all of the places in which it operates in order to engender that feeling. But my basic point still remains, and namely that the Joint does not pretend, nor could it ever, be a decisor, a decision-making body for world Jewry. It serves Jewry, and it also doesn't ask the question, when it serves people in Romania or in the former Soviet Union, are they Jewish, are they not Jewish? It avoids that because it has a specific role and it is not a world Jewish body in the sense of giving directions, guidelines, or anything else. I do want to make a comment, though the question was not addressed to me, but I did advert to it in my talk, but the gentleman who asked it wasn't present at my talk, and that is that Balei Tshuva do not, absolutely not, bring their critical faculties to their new lives. It's quite the opposite. They surrender their judgments, and they surrender their ability to make judgments to people whom they consider superior to themselves. A good example is my wife's cousin, who was in a Haredi yeshiva, and when I asked him, if your Rebbe told you that the world is flat, would you believe him? And he gave me a brilliant answer. No? He was much too smart to say yes. He said, I would have to. That captures exactly the essence. I know the world is round, but if my Rebbe tells me, I would have to believe it. Now that's a mindset which is not limited to Haredim. It's not limited, I mean, think of Arthur Kessler's Darkness at Noon. Okay, here we go. Rubashov, which I think was the name of a president of the state of Israel. But here you have a person surrendering his critical faculties for a higher cause. Dalia Ofer, in answer to you, Sami Smucha's book is about ethnic democracy, and Israel is not alone in this. Slovakia, Latvia, Estonia, Malaysia are other states which one could describe as ethnic democracies. That is to say, democracies which privilege one ethnic group over others, which grant the others individual but not collective rights. The issue that I was discussing was not whether Israel is a democracy or not a democracy, or an ethnic democracy or some other kind of democracy. And I fully agree both with you and Jakobson, Professor Jakobson from last night, that we now have hundreds of thousands of absolutely Israeli people who live and die for the country, whether they're riding on a bus or whether they're serving in the military, who are not Jews. But that's precisely the point. The fact that they are not Jews is not relevant to their being Israelis, but it will become relevant once matters of personal status arise. And I know Professor Jakobson addressed that last night, but it's not an easy issue to say, well, you're not Jewish, so you can't get married here, you have to go to Cyprus, and then, as you mentioned last night, the divorce problem. I think it's a question that can't be solved by these easy technological tricks. I fully agree, Dalia, that the Arab minority is a horse of a different color, because it is a unified, ethnically, linguistically, and by now almost religiously unified, that is to say, Islamic rather than Christian minority, which sees itself as such a collectivity, whereas I suspect that most non-Jews in Israel will see themselves not quite in the same unified terms, but rather as Russians, Ukrainians, Greeks, Romanians, whatever they may be. So they are two different and separable issues, each of which has to be, well, each of which doesn't have to be addressed from a practical point of view. It's only intellectuals who think that these issues have to be addressed. The State of Israel has proven over the course of more than 50 years that these issues can successfully be avoided.
Okay, I'll try and do it brief. As far as the going up to the Golan and the Negev, all I want to remind you is that a generation or more ago, this was these were very popular areas for young Zionist youth movements and the like. The Golan and the Negev.
They're now in Turkey.
Okay, well, I know where they are. I know where the Haredi yeshiva Bochurim are, and that's no. I should have mentioned that in the talk itself. That is no coincidence. As far as the second question, unfortunately, I admit to being a historian. I barely know what happened yesterday, so to predict it's going to be tomorrow. Besides the idea that, today in universities here in Israel there are courses in the Department of Sociology dealing with all the predictions of Israeli society that failed. So I would prefer not to be in that list. So I really can't answer that. As far as Beit Yaakov, Professor Frankel, the very fact that there is a battle on something that 20 years ago no one even considered as a battle is in and of itself indicative of something that's going on. Furthermore, consider when this battle is happening. It's something here, some momentum has drove this battle after we are already for a decade and a half or more deep into a situation in Beit Yaakov, and not only in Beit Yaakov, there is academic instruction to women, preparation for the market and the like. So it could be even, I don't know, here you understand that I'm not a native English speaker. How would you say in English, Milchemet Me'asef?
Rear action.
Okay, to an extent. The society has moved much further than the leadership is willing to accept, or even in silence. At some points it sort of strikes. Again, I don't know where it'll lead to, but the society has went such a step forward, I doubt it would go all the way back. That's my bet, if I had to bet. As far as the army, you're absolutely right. I don't disagree with the issue of the army. To the contrary, what I'm trying to say is that, I'll put it differently. In the last 2 or 3 years as a sociologist here at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, I've done a wonderful work or series of studies by interviewing Bachurei Yeshivot in the hardcore of the Lithuanian camp. One of the things that she has found, very interestingly, is second and third thoughts about why aren't we not going to the army. Now, if you find those thoughts, now these are thoughts. It's not that they're all getting up tomorrow and running to Lishkat Giyus. Fair enough. But the fact that you have thoughts, and serious thoughts, of why we are not part of society, and in Israel, being part of society means that, as well as a few other things, but means that, is very interesting. Now, let me remind you, American Orthodoxy took over 100 years to situate itself where it is today, or American Haredim, all right? It's a development over time. If you take into consideration the constraints of Israel, Zionism, Jewish society, and the span of time, I would wait and see. Not that, again, I'm not trying to predict anything. I think that these processes take a lot of time. What I'm trying to say is I think something is going on. No more than that. No less and no more. As far as Balei Tshuva, absolutely. They are problematic. They're problematic in comments, of course, from the Haredi point of view. Marriage-wise, absolutely. The only outstanding case is Chabad, and today, arguably, Chabad seems as though to have percentage-wise, more chazon b'tshuva than original, what you would call Chabad from birth, which changes the whole notion of, I don't think scholars have really internalized what that means, that over 50% of a religious movement is composed of people who were not born into that movement. I think we have to think about that. I don't know how, but we have to. And the other point, and here I beg to slightly differ with your comment before, one of the notions that at least I find in recent years is, as they say in Chinese, punkt verkehrt. Grunwald and the like are telling the chuzrim b'tshuva, the repenters, we want you to bring into Haredi society this critical, thoughtful eye view that you had from before, obviously with constraints, but bring it in because Haredi society needs this voice inside as well, which is interesting. I'm not saying it's prevailing, but it's interesting. Thank you.
I'd like to give my colleague Zvi the possibility to answer that I in some points disagree with him. One, the question of boundaries. Officially, there are no. I speak now about Russia today. Russia today, not the Soviet Union. There are boundaries by the society. Today, the mainstream, to be a Russian, that means to be a Pravoslav. And it's now enough to go in the streets in the summer or July, as I was in Moscow, and it is Moscow, and they go with crosses outside. It's a demonstration. And there are sociological researches that what is called the old churches and new believers in Russia, that are Russians who never visited church, but when you ask him, who are you? He says, "Ya pravoslavny." That means Russian and Pravoslav became synonymous. Now the question is, where will be the half, the quarter, the I don't know what part of Jews? Will they also be Pravoslavs? Because I don't speak about the Muslim society, it's about 15–18%. There is totally different. There are outsiders. They are not ours. The Jews are ours. But they are ours, they may be Russians. But the question is what will feel the second, third, fourth generation of a Jew, whatever it means, for him, for her. Will he be ready to put the cross and to say Pravoslav? And will the surrounding society, and I speak about society, it's not law, will be ready to accept him as a Pravoslav? And it's a very complicated, at least in Russia. In Ukraine it's totally different, and Lithuania is again different. So I think it's more complicated than we represented it, in my opinion in any case. So you have the possibility to disagree.
Let's think about boundaries as a brick wall with two layers. One layer is constructed from within and the other from without. So when ethnic groups are bounded, they are bounded not only by themselves, but they are bounded by the society in which they live. I had a discussion with Shlomo in Budapest, in fact, and I asked him whether Lueger's famous statement was really made by Lueger, and that is, "Wer ist ein Jude, das bestimme ich." In other words, he and perhaps later Hermann Göring said that it was they, as much as the Jews themselves, who decided who was going to be a Jew. So, of course, you're right, Mordechai, that it is the general society which defines Jews to at least the same extent, perhaps, well, maybe to the same extent as Jews define themselves. The Russian Federation, according to the census, is about 83% Russian and only 17% non-Russian. There is a struggle, I think. I don't think the question is as resolved as you seem to portray it. There is a struggle between people, and especially the established church, who would like to equate Russianness with orthodoxy, on the one hand. So the church tries to insert chaplains into the military, tries to control the media, tries to have church doctrines taught in the public schools. And on the other hand, what you might call in Israel secularists, who are trying to differentiate Russian ethnicity from Russian orthodoxy. Who will win that battle, I'm not sure. In one sense, to be Russian is to be Orthodox, just as to be Uzbek is to be Muslim.
Where is
Namely,
Putin? You don't put Putin as a factor.
Putin is not going to live forever, and he may
And
not even be president. This is really not, I'm sorry, that's not relevant. Putin, one way or the other. So he goes to church, so Yeltsin goes to church, and he makes this symbolic statement. The point is, Russian as Pravoslav is like Uzbek as Muslim. Namely, this is our cultural heritage, this is our tradition. That's exactly what we were talking about last night and today. Jewishness has at least a historic component of Judaism. Whether I am a practitioner today or a believer today is a separate question. But I do not claim that my ancestral traditions are Greek Orthodox or Shi'i Muslim. I know what they are. So do Russians. Whether Russian society will be increasingly be defined by religion or not is, to me, an open question. And it's a very interesting struggle that's going on. And you're absolutely right, Mordechai, as you rarely are, that we're very old friends. You're absolutely right that however this comes out, it will profoundly affect the Jews. And if they may have to choose to be Orthodox in order to be Russian, that is going to be very critical for the rest of us who will still consider them as Jews.
Thank you. Other questions? No. So thank you.